Welcome to the Ephesiology Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the study of the early Christian movement and its implications for the church today. Today, as always, we have Michael, our resident ephesiologist. I'm Andrew Johnson in Houston, Texas, and we are so happy to welcome not one, not two, but three incredible guests with us. We have Michelle Wegner, all the way from Kansas City. We have Dave Brunelle from deep in the throes of Ohio, Cleveland, correct? Did I get that right, Dave? Okay. And then Wade, well, don't laugh at me. This is just what I remember. And then Wade Mantlo, he is in Orlando, Florida. Okay, I didn't even ask before we started recording. So how do you say your last name properly?
Mantlo.
Mantlo, see? See, this is why you ask people, so you don't sound silly when you're recording a podcast that's live. Well, to one and all, this is the first of what we hope to be upcoming episodes on an archaeology-themed set of Ephesiology podcasts. And the other four people that I am interviewing today have recently got back from a large set of visits around different sites in Turkey and surrounding areas. So we wanted to welcome these incredible guests, and we want to welcome you as our listeners to kind of take part in experiencing a little bit of what they got to experience. Now, since I was not there, Michael, can you give an overview of where you were able to take them, or rather went with them on the excursions?
Well, it was quite an adventure, a journey for sure, and so much fun to be able to share this with friends, and we just, I think, at least I know I had a wonderful time, and I suspect that the others did as well. But let me provide some background here, because we're not just taking these trips willy-nilly. This is all focused on trying to get our heads around the missionary efforts of the 1st to 3rd century churches, and to see in the archaeological record of evidence for a Christian movement. Because my thesis has been that if indeed there was a Christian movement, particularly in Asia Minor, as this has been our focus on the Ephesiology podcast, then not only are we going to see it in the literary record, which we do, primarily in the New Testament, but also in some other sources, but we should also see it in the archaeological record. And so to be able to visit these sites and put our eyes on that material evidence is not only inspiring, but I think it's faith-building. It's what else? What other synonyms are there to inspiration? Just to be able to see what the early Christians saw, and to walk in their footsteps, and really come to a better appreciation for the challenges they faced, as well as the influence they had all throughout Asia Minor. It's just a remarkable experience. So all that to say, that we were able to visit a number of places in Asia Minor, more than what I have visited in the past. So we visited not only the 7 churches that we read about in Revelation chapters 2 and 3, but we visited 2 sites that Ignatius of Antioch writes to, that are not mentioned in the New Testament, and that's Trellis and Magnesia. And then we visit another site of Miletus, where Paul meets with the elders, and of course the exterior parts of that area, Didyma in particular, where the Temple of Apollo is, but also Pergamum, another just remarkable city that's not mentioned in the New Testament, but there's early evidence of Christianity there. So we did a lot. In 10 days, we traveled a good part of Western Turkey, and saw many things. So I'm really excited to hear from those who went on the trip with me about what they were impressed with and what they're taking away from that adventure.
Okay, so before that's a very broad scope. So, Michael, you said your goal was to kind of build passion almost, right? To inspire by express or showing people what God has done through his church in that era. So, how were you inspired? So I'll ask Wade first. Since I butchered his name, he will have the first crack. How were you inspired?
Well, the thing is, there's so many things that have stood out to me. I think it's important for us to reflect that between the land of Israel and the province of Asia, so much of the New Testament is in those two contexts. And so just the opportunity to go and see, just like in Israel, how the geography actually shapes the story.
Mm-hmm.
And you have this long history of so many groups coming through and just trying to see, that context really makes a huge difference as we look at the text. Being able to look at some of those writings of Paul in location brings a whole new dimension to what we're reading. And I think you just get some different insights, especially when we're looking through the lens of missiology and ecclesiology.
That is fantastic. I have follow-up questions, but I'm going to shelve them because I actually think the first question of inspiration is at least worth pursuing. Dave or Michelle, who wants to jump in next? What was inspiring to you?
Over to you, Michelle.
Okay. Just like Wade was saying, the geography was super interesting. We read about these places in the Bible, and it's hard to envision outside of like flannel graph Sunday school pictures. If you haven't been there, what these places might have looked like. And I was inspired by the beauty of almost every single place we visited. I mean, I knew nothing about Asia Minor or Turkey, honestly. And so I was very, very moved at how beautiful the landscapes were. And it was so interesting to me. My study has been around the area of beauty and how God uses beauty to draw us to himself. And at the different acropolises we visited, which are the high places, where temples were built and spiritual things happened. It was very interesting to me because almost all of them were surrounded like 360 by like incredible beauty, like valleys and hills and trees and just stunning beauty. And it just really made me think hard about like how the beauty of the land and their surroundings like prompted them to want to respond in some way, in some spiritual way. And the best they could, they knew and sensed and felt that there was something greater than themselves around them. And it was just very inspiring to me. And the juxtapositions at some of the places, where, like in Pergamum, it's the, in Revelations referred to like the throne of Satan or the seat of Satan. It's just very disturbing, it's almost like the enemy of our souls, like wanted to plant himself in all of those spaces. And it was very inspiring to me to go to a lot of these places, except Pergamum, and find evidences of the early church, where we found Christograms and crosses and all kinds of graffiti engraved in like the columns and on the ground. Christians were like, nope, we're claiming this back for Jesus and for his glory. So that was inspiring to me.
So that was some holy graffiti.
Yep.
God honoring ruining of property. So that's good. That's good.
They just made it better. I wouldn't say
I love it. I love it. Dave, what about you? How were you inspired on this trip?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with what Wade and Michelle said. For me, kind kind of piggybacking on what Michelle had said about the graffiti, was just the simplicity of the early church's message that Jesus is Lord, he's God, Savior. It's distilled simplicity, and that in the face of really just a culture saturated with idolatry and emperor worship, and these graffitis. The graffiti, what's the plural for that? Graffiti? Who knows? The graffiti that we saw, um, you began to get a feel for this kind of act of resistance. We had shared an article that it was that the idea of resistance through mimicry, and how they resisted emperor worship and just the simplicity of allegiance to Jesus as Lord, King, God. Yeah, that was inspiring.
There's a lot to pull on that thread. Before I jump away, Michael, you are not just one of the co-hosts, but you are also a subject of my interview now. So, Michael, how were you inspired?
Oh, you know what? That's going to take a book.
Mm.
Oh, come on. You're cheating. Can you at least give like a thought? No cheating. What was inspirational?
I mean, all of what Wade and Michelle and Dave have shared are inspiring to me. I mean, being in the place, I just recall what William Ramsey, who was one of the early pioneers of archaeology, what he said and how important it is for us to breathe the air of the geography of the first century to get a real feel for what was happening. And that certainly was inspiring. It's the beauty is inspiring as well. The sites really are stunning, and we're looking at ruins here. We're not looking at what it was exactly that the disciples, the early Christians, saw. And just to think about how even more stunning those sites would have been when they were not destroyed in ruins. And then the simplicity of Jesus Christ is God. I think that just comes out everywhere you go, except, as Michelle mentioned, except Pergamum. And there's a puzzle here that we're trying to solve. Because Pergamum, as Michelle said, was the seat of Satan, the throne of Satan, as Jesus describes it. And that's certainly evident when you're there. And you read inscriptions about Trajan being the Lord of the earth and the sea, and him being not only the Son of God, but a God. And you just see this polemical power struggle between the things of Christ and the things of the Roman emperors. And it comes out very plainly there. And to consider even that letter that Jesus writes to Pergamum being the only letter that references an actual person who was martyred, Antipas. And to consider, the fact that we're not seeing a lot of evidence of early Christianity there. We do have a few, two references historically about that church after the writing of the New Testament. No references to the church participating in any councils. It just really makes you wonder about how much warfare, spiritual warfare, was occurring in that place that Jesus called the throne of Satan. So yeah, all of those things I think are inspiring, but it always, of course, begs that question, Andrew, that you like to ask. So what? What does this mean to us today? And so that's what I'd love to hear from you all. What are you taking away from this trip that you see as something applicable for what you're doing today?
We'll start with Michelle.
Oh gosh. So many things. Pretty much every spare minute I've had since I've been home, which has not been a lot of spare minutes. um, been kind of busy, but anyway, I have just written so much about my experience. Overall takeaways, though, I think is the resilience of the early church. Um, reading more about Antipas and how he was martyred. And yesterday I was reading about a couple other people that went to Pergamum and were martyred there. And I can't remember her name, but Michael might know. I think you might have read about them too. Two men that she was with were being martyred for their faith. And then she spoke up and said, well, I'm a follower of Jesus too. And then she was also martyred. And, being in that place and seeing and feeling that spiritual darkness and everything, it was just very inspiring to me to know that there were people over time that were confident enough in their faith and in Jesus to speak up. And I don't know, it was just very, very powerful to me. And I haven't worked it all out yet in my heart and spirit and mind, but stories like that were, of resilience were very moving to me.
Yeah, and how applicable that is today, all around the world where, and even in the Western context, particularly in the United States, where Christians oftentimes feel victimized because of things that are going on politically. Right. What we see in the early church is just that resilience, the faithfulness, the continual declaration that Jesus Christ is God. I think just rings out so astonishingly in the early church, and something that we should apply today. But even thinking about the persecuted church around the world and the challenges that they face, and being able to look back at the faithfulness of those early believers as they were facing just horrible and traumatic ways to be persecuted. The people that Michelle was referencing, the testimony is that they were clawed, they were hung up and clawed, where their flesh was just ripped from their muscles, and crying in agony, but still remaining faithful to the Lord and not denying Him. Is just a remarkable testimony of resilience and perseverance and all of those things. Dave, how about you? What are you taking away?
Yeah, I would come back to a little bit about what I shared earlier, that just the simplicity of the early church's message. It was, unencumbered. It wasn't a heaven-hell test. It was just a declaration. Jesus is the saving King. He's God. And I was staying up late last night talking with my son-in-law, and I've just been reflecting on this from Acts chapter 17, when Paul's missionary troop was in Thessalonica, and the Jews got jealous, and they basically raised this rabble, and their accusation was, these men have turned the world upside down, who have turned the world upside down, have come here also, and Jason has received them, and they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. And that's not it's not an empty it's not a hollow accusation. But I think that the early Christians understood, no, this is a matter of allegiance. We have a real king on a real throne. He's an actual person, not an imaginary, not an ethereal thing, but a real king, and he has our allegiance. That has struck me. And, some of, not prevalent, but some of the conversations that I've had about the trip, there's almost this reaction of, wow, well, boy, it's a really good thing we don't have empires and Caesars anymore, isn't it? I was again talking with my son-in-law last night. Alex, if you listen to this, yo, thanks. No, we still have Caesars and we still have an empire. We've just domesticated them,
Right.
and they're a whole lot more subtle.
Hmm.
And I think the enemy prefers it that way. But we still have empires. We still have Caesars, and um, I think the early church's testimony is that they were not a subculture; they were a counterculture.
Mm.
They loved radically. They were active in the places where God had them, but they were not a subculture. They were a counterculture. Um, and I think all too often, um, Christianity, at least in the West, seems like it can just fit into a subculture.
Hmm.
Uh, and I think, yeah, that I don't know. I mean, I don't even remember the question anymore. But yeah, that was one of the that's how it's impacting me today. There we go.
Yeah, good. I love that. Wade, how about you?
Yeah, just like everyone else, it's like we could have a whole separate podcast just on these things. I think I've been writing and reflecting on this as well, but if I had to choose just one, because of the work that we're doing is in church planting, the fact that there's no archaeological evidence for a synagogue in Ephesus is pretty significant, actually.
Mm.
Because the text clearly says in Acts 19:8 that Paul entered the synagogue, but yet we don't see that. And so, we talked about this on our trip, Michael, just the implications. If there was no building known as a synagogue, it means that Paul entered into a gathering of people. And we consistently came up with this throughout the tour, talking about, you guys on your podcast, you've been talking about adaptive methods and stuff. And it just struck me that the emphasis on the first century, how they looked at gatherings, were very people focused. It wasn't so much about the building. And it's so foreign to us today that, obviously we say church automatically, it's a building. It's just something we learn by osmosis almost. It's just kind of out there. And so it's amazing to me how much effort it takes to kind of go back and recalibrate our minds to focus on people. But
Mm.
yet in the first century, we see these things, and I think Michael, you had even mentioned some research you were doing in Corinth about the possibility of the synagogue not referring to a building in that location either. And so we think about the application of that. Could we, or what would it look like if we only focused on the gathering of the people, the quality of that gathering of people, over what type of structure should they meet in? And that was just huge for me, just to kind of go, oh my goodness, he spent so much time here. Obviously, there were Jews here. We found like menorah graffiti, I guess, there at
Mhm.
on certain places, and yet they still have not found a location of where they think a synagogue building would have been. So that's very interesting. I think it has some pretty significant implications. Especially as we try to take the gospel to places that have no Christian witness. What does it look like to focus on gatherings of people?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, Wade. And that certainly has been one of the takeaways for me as well. As we have been talking about adaptive ecclesiology, we certainly get a greater sense of what that could have looked like when you're there and you see these different sites. To just kind of build on what Wade was talking about, the Greek word synagogue is a Greek word, and it's not a Hebrew word. And sometimes we miss that because we've become so accustomed with thinking about synagogue as something that is Hebrew rather than Greek. But the Greeks use the word as well. And we have a number of instances in the epigraphic record of different types of synagogues. Sometimes they were pagan places of worship, like a synagogue of Zeus, for example. Or the word was used in relationship to trade guilds. And so we have epigraphic inscriptions of the synagogue of barbers, or the synagogue of pottery workers, and so on. And so when we meet the word synagogue in the New Testament, we should be thinking about the breadth of the lexical range of the word and begin to look more at the context. And so it very well could be, like Wade had mentioned in regards to Corinth, that the synagogue was a trade guild, because that really is the context of Paul's ministry in Corinth. He goes there, he meets with Priscilla and Aquila, they're of the same trade, and he interacts with the synagogue. And then kind of alongside of that, the archysynagogos, the often translated the ruler of the synagogue, can also be translated as a trade master. And we have examples of this, different archysynagogos who are trade masters of various guilds in the first century and earlier. And so all of those things we have to keep in context. And I think being on the site in these various cities and coming to deeper questions about why are we not seeing an archaeological record of actual physical buildings called synagogues really makes us think about the significance of the early Christianity's engagement in the Jewish communities and all sorts of things. And so, I mean, it's one thing to say that there's no current evidence for the existence of synagogues in many of these cities, but it's another thing to say, well, perhaps it hasn't been discovered yet. And in the case of
that's got to be a
Ephesus,
possibility.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Ephesus
Sure.
is only 10 to 20% excavated at this point. And then, too, we have to realize that, just as we talk about house churches, we can also talk about house synagogues, that the Jews would meet in homes. And so that's certainly a possibility. And just as we have very little archaeological evidence for actual house churches, we have little evidence for house synagogues as well. But I'd love to hear more about your all's experience, particularly in Laodicea, when we did encounter what many believe to be an actual house church.
And let me jump in just for a second, if you don't mind, because I think that I want to put another side to the synagogue discussion. I think it was Michelle that helped us make the connection by discovering that peacock, and I think it was at Prene up on the mountain there. And we saw a synagogue that we think could have been, it was an actual building, but it looks like that space was now being used by Christians, quite possibly. And so that's the other piece or the other side of the synagogues. We did see some buildings, but sometimes repurposed. And so that was interesting.
Yeah, and in that case, that was a building in the midst of a number of houses. And so it seems apparent that it was one of those house synagogues that we were talking about.
And since I wasn't there, I can jump in before you all start talking Laodicea. I do think this is a fascinating, I won't say revelation, but a continuation of what we already believe in our faith, that, what is Christian? Well, technically Christian, it's people, it's a noun, right? We love to throw it as an adjective, but what is the difference between a Jewish building and a Christian building? Well, Christians can inhabit any space, any place. We adapt, right? That's the beauty of so much of what we have talked about, is that Christians come into that place, and it's the claim. What makes us Christian is that we believe that Jesus is Lord, and that's it. So the building doesn't have to be so high. It doesn't have to have X number of columns. It doesn't exist to have an altar and certain things to say, oh, now it has all the elements. It is Christian. Any building, any space, a home, large gathering, it can all be repurposed for the gathering of the people of God. And it's because of who we serve, not the look of things, that makes it Christian. Anyway, just a thought. Like I said, I wasn't there with you. Michael, you asked a really great question about Laodicea. So Michelle, I jumped in. You were about to talk.
Yeah, again, the actual like geography and the structures in Laodicea were just stunning. Like the white marble columns, contrasting with the blue sky and the surroundings. I mean, it was just like visually stunning. And I don't know what percent of it is excavated, but it was huge. Like it took a couple hours, maybe like 4 hours to walk around it, and we didn't even really look at every single thing. So yeah, it was extraordinary. And I think what hit me the most there was the sizes of the house structures and the churches and things. Because when we read back, in the Bible about the church, like we picture people meeting in homes, and that perception was wrong in my head, because the homes that most people had were very, very small, can maybe fit 4 people, not 30, 40, like I had in my head, of what a house church would mean. And so, we talked about the oikos, which would mean like the gathering of the people, and Michael will be able to share this better than I will, but it was obviously larger groups of people in larger spaces. So it was just super interesting to me.
Mm. Dave, Wade, thoughts on Laodicea?
So yeah, I would agree, like piggyback with what Michelle said there. The one house church that they say is a house church with the Ichthus wheel out in front, had not one but 2 apsidal halls. And yeah, would that have been a house church? Yes. Could it have accommodated 80 or 90 people? Sure. Which it kind of shatters that monolithic view of house church in the other direction as well. But that was also where the fountain to Trajan was. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'll get back, kind of, this is the bone that I'm chewing. That the fountain with Trajan, massive, beautiful fountain. Trajan is like what, 10 or 11 feet tall, and there is a much more diminutive character at his feet, representing the Germanic tribes, the Germans,
the Dacian tribes.
the Dacian tribes, much smaller and cowering, almost a footstool to him. And again, just seeing the wow, he's a pretty big deal around here. And wasn't that also where that list of church rules was, the canon for that?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah.
Those were a trip, and kind of disturbing also.
Okay, time out. Since I was not there, what do you refer to? What do you mean church rules? What are some of the things you were seeing?
I just remember reading that women weren't allowed. And was this like the Byzantine era when it was written, I imagine. So it had been a couple hundred years, the church was up and running, and by then already, they were telling women to be quiet. And I was very surprised by that, especially in Laodicea, which seemed like a very strong group of believers. And anyway, there were way more rules than that, but
there was a long list of, like, I don't know, 20, 30, right? And some of them were like open women will not approach an elder. Deacons or they weren't to go to taverns. They couldn't go. Christians couldn't go to theater. Um, and so, yeah, want to be. It was discouraging, but also want to be charitable because you don't really know what was going on in the church that they felt the rules were necessary. Um, and just really quick thing about the adaptive nature of the church, the museum in Ephesus. I thought it was really interesting that we saw the word for elder there.
Yeah.
It was on an inscription attributed to. There was a bust of a guy that honestly could be in my family tree. Kind of reminded me of my uncle, one of my uncles. Like, wow, what did this dude do? Like, man, was he a philosopher or a builder or a warrior? No, he was a champion flute player. And beat out all these other flautists from other cities. And the elders of the city gave him a special award. And it's the exact same word we have, in the New Testament scriptures for the word elder, except it's not super spiritualized. No, these were leaders in the city that just said, "Hey, this dude's a flippin' awesome flute player. He beat all these other cities. We should give him an award." And they did.
What is that word that you saw that we translate as
Over to
elder?
you, Michael.
Yeah, well, presbyteros.
That's what I was about to say, but
yeah.
I was just venturing a guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was part of the fun. Well, part of the fun for me, of course, is reading the various inscriptions and seeing the language that was used that we see in the New Testament, and really getting a deeper appreciation for how the New Testament writers used the language that was available to them to talk about the church, the structure of the church, and so on, and that comes out very clearly, and it tells us something about the adaptive nature of the early church. To be able to use language that was meaningful to the people then, and by way of application, I think it provides us a model for us to say, what language should we be using today that is meaningful to people, that connects to them, and kind of serves as a bridge from the majority culture to Christianity.
Wade, we don't want to leave you out of the Laodicean conversation. Do you have any observations or reflections still ruminating?
Yeah, I think it's one of the more impressive sites that you have an opportunity to visit if you can go. Definitely, it's one I would say don't miss it because of the example of a oikos that we think was used as a Christian space. It just struck me too as we went around on the trip, particularly Laodicea, just the fact that Paul basically chose existing leaders to be leaders of these new gatherings of believers. And we get that impression just from the different lists of qualifications of a leader that Paul would have written to. Someone who manages their oikos well, that's already an existing leader. And so sometimes, again, back to application for church planning, that's very significant. Going into a culture and saying, who should be the leader? How do we appoint leaders or choose them? Well, it seems like Paul chose people who were leaders in the society already. And so that obviously shows some of that maybe natural gifting, some of that allowed access into different aspects of society. So it could have been very strategic, but also just from a leadership standpoint, some of those qualities that were already there. Okay, that's a natural fit, maybe to be someone who would help be an overseer or an elder of this new gathering of believers. Laodicea, the two theaters there were just amazing. One of them they are reconstructing, and so we got to set and really get a pretty good idea of what it would have looked like. And by the way, I would just to promote going on this tour with Michael, if you have a chance, it's very likely you'll be able to talk to archaeologists on site and get some of the latest information from them. That was such a highlight for all of us. We got some backdoor access to some of these sites, including Laodicea.
No
And so
photos.
we
No
were,
photos. No
yeah,
photos. No photos.
we got reprimanded several times of taking illegal photos. Um, but yeah, just incredible insights. Some of the things that they're finding. The You had mentioned, I actually took a picture of all the rules or the canons from the meeting there in 343 AD. There were actually 60, Dave, believe it or not.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of those. And a lot of them did talk about the things that were prohibited for women, but also there were some things that said things like none of the priesthood or clergy could go on a journey without the bishop's approval. And so, again, there was just a lot of interesting things. I'm sure you could find this probably online. The other evidence my last comment would simply be again, in the market, we saw an excellent example of what's called the Tau Row. Is that correct pronunciation, Michael?
Yeah.
I can't give a good description of that. Maybe you want to help with that. But in the market, you have this very clear graffiti or symbol that someone had carved on one of the main columns that is a clear exaltation of Jesus as Lord. And not too far from that, we saw this very interesting menorah that had a cross coming out of the center candlestick. And so we had a lot of fun trying to think about, okay, what was that about? What were the implications of that whole thing? And so I don't know that we landed on a clear understanding, but pretty impressive. Obviously, Christian influence on those two examples.
Yeah, and I think what is so remarkable when we think about Laodicea, at least to me, is considering how Jesus addressed that church in Revelation chapter 3. Laodicea was the church that he was ready to vomit out of his mouth because they were so complacent in their faith. And yet, what we see in the archaeological record is that they seem to have taken heed to what Jesus was telling them. And their faith was anything but complacent, if the archaeological record has a testimony to share about those early Christians. And so the fact that we have an example of a really beautiful house church with a Christogram at its doorway, the fact that even in the what's called the Western Theater that Wade was talking about, that there's evidence for Christians using that space to gather. And then the different church structures that are there that certainly are built in the 4th century and beyond. But there were at least 5 different church structures, buildings that were used for places of worship. There just testifies, and all the graffiti that Wade was mentioning, the Christogram or the menorah and cross graffiti, the stawogram or the Tau Row symbol of the cross, all of that testifies to a vibrant Christianity in that city, and that should encourage us. I think, here was a church that Jesus saw as being apathetic, and they listened to him, and their faith was ignited, and you can see it in the archaeological record.
It's also interesting to me to hear you all talk specifically on those canons and those rules that you saw. It strikes me as funny if you've heard the phrase "every rule has a name," right? Because somebody did something that they shouldn't have done,
Yes.
and then somebody had to make a rule because of that person. And it always strikes me, especially hearing these, like, okay, if you're going to go on a journey, you've got to ask the bishop. I was like, okay, so who was the guy who thought it was a good idea, and how bad did it go that they had to make a rule for him?
Exactly.
That everybody else said, you can't do what he did.
Right.
And so, I always find that fascinating, is that sometimes what we're seeing, again, we are now looking back in history. We are looking at
Right.
these canons and we're going, oh, what's the spiritual significance? And it was just like, what did Michael do that they had to make a rule for
Yes.
him that we, absent of context, we have to try to figure out who was this church and how did they act and what were their passions, and somebody just messed up. Anyway,
Yeah.
strikes me as fascinating. Okay, let me turn us towards just kind of landing this plane. Why do you think others should take a trip like this in the future? It's already kind of been teased out. So, Michael, I will let you have the final word on this. So let's go, Dave, and then Wade, and then Michelle. Why do you think others should take a trip like this in the future?
So it's funny. I got back and a good friend said, "Hey, while you were in Turkey, I watched this show on Amazon. It was Drive Through History, and yeah, you probably maybe you just should have stayed home and watched that. You would have saved some money." I was like, "Oh, okay, yeah." So I started watching it, but yeah, I think the a lot if you have the opportunity to do it, it does certainly frame out a lot of context for you in understanding the scriptures and understanding just the cultural societal setting of the early church. I think it really can inform that.
Yeah, I agree. I guess I kind of alluded to what in my opening comments. Just the geography shapes the story. Um, I the difference between watching a video on TV and actually being able to be there. Obviously, any type of video camera is going to give you a limited scope of what's in the screen.
Right,
But being
right.
there physically, you're going to get the whole 360. You're going to, I can't overemphasize what it was like, or it's hard to express what it was like to say, okay, I read about this guy on the pages, um, but there's an inscription that has his name in it. Wow. I don't know. It's just, when you go to, the picture behind me here is the Theater of Miletus. The fact that there's an inscription for a section for God-fearers, it's like, whoa, that's really concrete. It's not just something on a page. It's not something in a video. It's like, wow, okay, real people in this location, they walked right here. They had to go up these steps just like we are. For them to go to the market and interact with people, this was the environment. And to me, that just completely adds a different layer of context to the scriptures, and helps us fill in some of those blanks that we miss when we're just reading. So yeah, extreme privilege, amazing privilege to go. If you have the chance, do go. And I do like the fact that Michael offers this opportunity to have a little bit of a smaller group where you are able to interact with some archaeologists and do some things that you normally would not be able to do if you were with a larger crowd. And so it just made it a much nicer time of interacting, discussing the text on location. And I don't think any of us will ever be able to pick up the Bible and look at it the same again. So if you do
Oh,
get that
dang.
chance, I do recommend it.
Wade,
Wow. Okay.
agreed. And you're sitting in the God-fearer section right now, aren't you?
Yes, I am actually. So thanks for, it's just
Yeah.
right below me here. So
Yeah.
That's amazing. Michelle, what about you?
Yeah. I've read the Bible my entire life and believed the Bible my entire life and what it says, but being in these places just really built a stronger foundation, I think, for my faith. And um, like Wade said, just really feels concrete under me, I don't know, just really significant, powerful experience for me, increasing my faith even more. And it was just beautiful. And if anybody has the chance to do it, I would 100% recommend going.
Yeah, well, it doesn't take much for me to get excited about being in these places. And I think, though, the most exciting thing for me is being able to share these experiences with others. It was so much fun to have these three and one other, we won't mention his name, but one other who joined us, and to walk around these sites and think together. And literally do theology and community, where theology was born. To have those experiences is just faith altering in some way. And I'm with Michelle. When I read Scripture now, the New Testament, I don't read it like I used to read it. And seeing where these believers were, understanding what it was that they were challenged by, and to come back to Scripture and have that as a background, is just it's a remarkable thing. So we're hoping that these are trips that we'll do regularly. I know we have one coming up in March with another team. This past trip in November raised a number of more questions for me as I'm doing research for a book on missiology and archaeology. And so we'll begin to explore some of those questions. And that will take us into places where we weren't able to go on this last trip. And I'm excited about that and looking forward to it. And we're hoping to expand these opportunities as well into Greece and perhaps into Israel if things quiet down there before too long. But having these opportunities to, especially for those of us who are in ministry, who are leaders, who have been charged with teaching Scripture, to be able to have these experiences just illuminates the text so much more. And it helps us to be able to communicate, I think, much more effectively to those that we're discipling. And to help them to get a deeper appreciation for what those early believers were going through.
If anybody has been sold and is super excited about even the potential of going, Michael, how would they communicate that? Where would they go?
Yeah, well, communicate it with me. You can always reach me at michael@ephesiology.com. I'm happy to interact with you on our next trips. Most likely we'll do one in the fall of 2025. We have one in the spring already scheduled, but I'm sure we'll do one in the fall of 2025. And so just connect with me and I'll let you know when the dates are secured.
This is incredible. Well, I want to certainly thank the three of you who don't normally appear on this podcast for sharing your time with us, your hearts, your experiences. Dave, Wade, Michelle, it's been a joy to have you. And I look forward to whatever excuse we can to have you back on again. We'll change the topic. We'll extend the archaeological dig, and we'll have greater conversation moving forward. But thank you so much for being with us. And we also want to thank you, our listeners, for joining us in this conversation. This is not an archaeology podcast up to this point. So if there's other things that you wonder, have we covered those topics, and you're just discovering us now, please go back on our back catalog, check out what we have covered, or go online to masterclasses.ephesiology.com to see what more ephesiology can help you accomplish in what God is stretching you towards. So for Michael, myself, Wade, Dave, and Michelle, thank you so much for joining us on the Ephesiology Podcast.